Okey-dokey. Still have people on the road, I guess. So we'll just proceed as we are. Questions and or conundrums, dilemmas from y'all? Anybody? Nobody? Somebody? Well, that's the offer. I'm going to do Obadiah, and then because it's only one chapter, and then I'll make that offer. Why? Well, go ahead. Okay. Yeah, I think you've mentioned that. So yeah, I will take that under advisement. Anything else? Anybody wants to yak about? All right, so got this question yesterday, as a matter of fact. Does anybody remember Operation Just Cause? You do? Do you really? Wow. No. Ah, we have a historian. You weren't in the service in '89, were you?
No.
I didn't think so.
They had a long-standing, well, that's why the whole canal zone was established.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
People were there from 93 to 96.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
a child.
Okay, cool. Okay, so Operation Just Cause happened exactly 36 years ago today. Yesterday, on the 3rd. Friday. Was Friday the 3rd? No, yesterday was the 3rd. Okay. So 36 years ago, yesterday, exact same day, Operation Just Cause. The question I got was, what's the difference, or is there a difference, between Operation Just Cause and the capture of Maduro, and how does this apply to the biblical standards of a just war? That was the question. So, quick comparison. Manuel Noriega was originally a CIA operative. He was hired by the CIA to spy on the government at the time. I can't remember the guy before him. I think his name was Diaz, but I'm not 100% sure. Was hired to spy on him and basically disrupt communist influence in Panama. You may remember that Nicaragua had gone communist, and there was a lot of concern about Panama at that time, of course, because of the Panama Canal and all that, becoming communist. And so Noriega was a government official at the time and basically worked for the United States. The ruler of the country was deposed by a military coup. Noriega took over. He never claimed to be the president of Panama. He never claimed any political office. Okay, he just ran the country. As we know about anything about power, you get a lot of power, you tend to abuse it. He didn't have any checks and balances on him. The government was basically non-functioning, so he could do pretty much whatever he wanted to do. He then began to, one more thing. When he was working for the CIA, one of the other things he did was he was a negotiator or a go-between at that time between Cuba and the United States. There were no relations at all between Cuba and the United States, diplomatic relations at that time. And so we used Noriega to get messages to Fidel Castro, and Castro used Noriega to get messages to us, and so on and so forth. Whenever there was a need to have some kind of communication, to fix a problem or deal with some, like the boat people, if you remember that, back in the 80s, and all that. So Noriega was very useful to us for a decade and a half, maybe 15, 20 years. And then he became not so useful when he took power, because he, again, wanted to make a lot of money, wanted to become more powerful, more rich and whatever. And so he started not just working with Cuba, but inviting Cuban people into his government and into the country. And as you know, of course, Cuba was allied with the Soviet Union at that time. The other thing he started to do was he started to take over the drug business. Panama, of course, right smack between South America, Colombia, Venezuela, whatever, and Mexico. Great place to traffic drugs back and forth. He stepped in to be the middleman and make a lot of money, much like Maduro has been doing for the last few years. It got to the point where the CIA fired him, basically said, "We don't want to use you anymore. You can go away now." He did not go away. He doubled down and made all kinds of threats about the Panama Canal and using it against us and so on and so forth. George H.W. Bush, old man George, old Bush, he decided that this was an untenable situation, a bad situation, and so on January 3rd, 1989, he sent U.S. troops into Panama. Of course, they were already there. A lot of them were already there. As Stephanie said, her family was there in the Panama Canal Zone. Susan Jamka's father was also in the Panama Canal Zone at some point, maybe not right then, but it was pretty common to have Army troops stationed in Panama for a number of years. Anyway, he sent troops from the Army bases in Panama into the country itself, captured Noriega, flew Noriega to Florida, where it just so happened that my cousin, Gene Pryor, was working for the State Department at that time in the Pentagon, and liaison in the Pentagon, and spoke very good Spanish. He had been a UN, American UN advisor in one of the South American little countries, Guyana, Suriname, one of those guys. Anyway, she had been there for some years, and they asked her to go down from Washington, D.C. to Florida to interrogate Noriega. She spent actually a couple years living in Florida, and she became Noriega's #1 person he saw in prison for 2 years. Anyway, so the comparison there is that Maduro did win a number of elections, was elected, inaugurated, sworn in, whatever, as president of Venezuela. He had the backing of the unions, he had the backing of the military, of course, and such and so. Other than that, there was actual fighting in Panama. The Panamanian troops put up resistance. I believe the number I remember was 25. I doesn't think it was more than 30, but I think it was 25, 26 American soldiers actually died, well, actually lost their lives. A good friend of mine who was a member of my congregation in El Paso was a Green Beret, and he was one of the first to go into Panama territory. He had a hand in capturing Noriega, and in his group there was a couple of casualties. So it was an armed conflict. It was an actual armed conflict, much like Grenada before that was an armed conflict. So this one does not seem to have been any kind of armed conflict. There are conflicting reports right now as to the reaction of the actual people in Venezuela, depending on which newscasts you listen to or which newspapers you read. Some say that people are celebrating in the streets, waving American flags and being very thankful, and others are saying, no, people are rioting and protesting and so on and so forth. It probably will take a while to ferret out exactly what is going on there. This brings us, so there is a little bit of a difference. Noriega was not duly elected. He was not the head of anything. He was not really the head of the government in a legal term. Maduro was the head of the government in a legal way, even though the United Nations, for example, would say the last election where he was elected, they said that was bogus, that his opponent, Gonzalez, probably got more votes. Be that as it may, we know we've had those kinds of problems in this country ourselves. Somebody gets more votes than somebody else and they don't get elected. All right, so that really has no bearing on it. The question becomes, is this biblically correct, what the current administration has done? Now, in Christianity, there is something that has grown up over the last 100 years. It's basically the concept of a just war. And one of the reasons that old George Bush used the term Operation Just Cause is because he made a very strong appeal and attempt to describe the incursion into Panama as just, okay, because of the suffering of the Panamanian people and because of the illegal activity that Noriega was involved in. All right. Now, I haven't heard our current president or anybody, Hegseth or anybody else, use this particular term. I haven't heard. Maybe you have. I haven't heard. I haven't seen it in any reports yet. But I think it behooves us as believers to consider this. Can this be referred to, let's say, as a just war? There are 5 definitions, I would say, or parts of a definition to what is a just war. Okay, let's go over those. And these are based mostly on Romans chapter 13, on the laws in Exodus that we went over about invading Canaan, land of Canaan, and God dealing with people like that. Also other Old Testament things, and also various comments made by Peter, James, and other apostles talking about war, talking about killing, talking about defense, defending yourselves, and so on and so forth, and Jesus too, for that matter. So take it, this is not just one passage or 2 passages or whatever. This is really the Bible in complete context. The first principle is that a just war is declared by a legitimate government, a legitimate ruler, whether it's a king, which is just one guy, or whether it's a parliament, which are a bunch of guys, or Congress, or whatever. So it is declared means it's not secret. Okay, so one of the ideas behind a just war is this isn't going on behind a curtain somewhere. This isn't surreptitious. It's above board. Okay, I should also say, when we talk about war, okay, war is defined in the dictionary as armed conflict between governments or groups with a command structure. okay? So to have an actual war, you have to have two groups, either governments of two countries or within a country, like a civil war, two groups within a country that actually have leaders, general, colonel, major, or, commandante, whatever you want, a comrade, whatever. But so there's orders given. In other words, you're obeying the orders of a superior. A superior can say, don't do that, and you have to obey, or do that, and you have to obey. That's the definition of war, and I think that definition of war, holds even going all the way back to the times of the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and stuff like that. So that's the definition of war. It's armed conflict. Some people would add armed open conflict. Again, the idea being that it's above board. It's not secret. You're not hiding anything. Okay? People know the blue is against the gray, the green is against the white, whatever. The red is against the white, in its act. And so people know there are sides, and you can choose sides. You can fight for the green, or you can fight for the purple. Whatever you want to do. And if you're in the purple's land, you fight against the green, and if you're in the green's land, you fight against the purple, and so on and so forth. Okay, and this is important because then this makes it possible to control. The conflict is violent by definition. It's destructive by definition, but it's controlled violence. All right, it's not just indiscriminate murdering of people for no particular reason. The idea, and again, this even goes back to ancient times. And people sometimes talk about rules of war, and the famous scene, of course, in Bridge on the River Kwai, when the Japanese commandant is talking to the British colonel, and the British colonel pulls out the Geneva Conference book, and the Japanese colonel hits it with his stick and says, "There are no rules in war." Even the Japanese had rules in war. It's just that their rules were different. Okay? Their rules were you don't surrender and you don't take captives. Because it's dishonorable to surrender. And so rather than surrender, you shoot the guy. You don't take him captive, you shoot him. You're doing him a favor. That's Bushido thinking. That's samurai thinking. Okay, samurai thinking is you don't want to dishonor the poor guy. He's your opponent, and you honor him as opponent, and so you cut his head off when you beat him, so that he doesn't have to go to prison or whatever, right? Now, later in the war, they changed that because they saw that having prisoners was beneficial, and so they changed it. So there are rules. There's always been rules. Back when Troy and Athens were fighting, and there was always rules. Okay, so the first idea is kind of legitimate, to legitimize the whole process and give the process a structure, so that we'll have a little bit of control. Okay, that's the first point. The second point is that a war, just war, should be the last resort. In other words, it should be only after negotiations have broken down, after every attempt has been made to modify the situation, to fix the situation in a nonviolent way. Right? So it should be a last resort. It should not be the first thing that you think of doing. Right? You got a problem, let's say with Canada. You don't like Canada taking all the Jim Beam off their shelves in their stores, and so we invade Canada right away, as soon as they do that. Okay? It's on our shelves, yeah. But you see what I mean? That's not the first thing you do right out of the box. Okay, you negotiate. All right, and so this again, try to control the situation. This is not something you want to do. This is something that you have to do. Okay. Number three is and this where the just cause comes in. Now, this becomes a little nebulous. What is a just cause? Most of the time, going back through history, a just cause is seen as to relieve suffering or defend land, people of your country. Okay? So a defensive war is always a just war. If somebody invades you and you declare war on them back, that's always a just war. This was the thinking behind the World War II, for example. We did not get into World War II because we did not feel that either the Germans or the Japanese were threatening us. We did not feel threatened at the time. And Roosevelt had promised 1940 in his election that the sons of American mothers would never fight on foreign soil. He saw that that's not something that people want. They don't want us getting involved in like we did in World War I. That was very that thought up until December 6th of 41, that thought was very popular. We're not going to get involved in another European war where it cost us 1 million of our young men back in World War I. Okay? But of course, when you're attacked, again, that's been then seen as a defensive war. Or in the case of other situations, like Korea, for example, was thought, the South Koreans did not have allies and a lot of troops in their area at that time. North Korea, of course, did, and all the Chinese and the Russians and everything else. And so they invaded, and we went to relieve the suffering and to protect the people of South Korea from being murdered and brutalized and slaughtered by the North Koreans, Chinese, Russians, et cetera, et cetera. You could throw in Vietnam in that category too, and many other of our excursions into the world. Afghanistan, I suppose you could throw in there, Iraq and Iran. You could throw a lot of them in there, okay? So relieve suffering and so on and so forth. So for example, in this current case, the administration is saying, look, the people in Venezuela are starving. People in Venezuela are suffering greatly. They have electric blackouts. They don't have food. They don't have water, clean water. They don't have this. They don't have that. They were at one time the richest country in South America by many, many values, by many measuring sticks. Who was the guy that died? Chavez, thank you. Hugo Chavez turned it into a socialist paradise, which means that everybody suffered equally. That's the definition of socialism, when everybody suffers equally. Okay. Any case, this is why you will hear Hegseth and others talk about, we went to relieve suffering and so on and so forth. And also they will throw in then again Maduro's very active involvement in drug cartels and skimming money off of them and making money off of drugs coming into the country and so on and so forth. And that's why he was indicted last year, before Trump was inaugurated. He was indicted, I believe, in September, might have been October, either September or October of 25. He was, 24, excuse me, he was indicted by a grand jury in, I believe, New York, for drug running, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Both bounty on him, I think was increased to 50 million. Oh, it was increased to 25 million? Okay. Okay, number 4. A just war must have, I guess the best word I could use is prudent. You could also say measurable goals. Okay? We're going to do this, we're going to accomplish this thing right here, and then we're going to come home. We're not going to drag this out for decades and decades and decades and decades. So like the 100 Years' War. Why did the 100 Years' War last a long time? Because the English said, hey, France really belongs to us. Because back a couple hundred years ago, the Queen of France married the King of England. And France and England became one country with the English king as the king. So France belongs to us. And so we're not going to quit until we get it back. So that lasted 100 years. Okay? But it was a very measurable goal. As soon as the English king was enthroned on the French throne, the war would be over. Now, it didn't happen that way. That led to the 100 Years' War was 100 Years' War because a lot of the people in France, when Henry V took over, after he won the Battle of Agincourt, he became King of France, for all intents and purposes. And he was actually said to be. He was actually made the King of France. And it's interesting, when Charles was not inaugurated, what's the word? Enthroned, whatever. When Charles III was enthroned, if you listened carefully, he was enthroned as the King of England, France, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, okay? He was those things. He was, kings of England and queens of England have always been enthroned as the king or queen of France ever since those days. Okay? Technically, England has never given that up. They have never surrendered France. As far as they are concerned, France belongs to them still to this day. Now, of course, the French would argue that, but that's what. Anyway, measurable goals. Okay, so we go into Afghanistan. The measurable goal: throw the Taliban out. Okay, we did. Throw the Taliban out, installed a government, okay, and we can leave. Well, we didn't, of course, because there were insurgents and guerrillas and everything else causing all kinds of problems, and eventually we decided we can't win this stupid thing, let's just go home. So that's what they did. Same with Vietnam. What was the goal? Well, the goal was already achieved. If you remember, you wouldn't, you weren't alive, but if you read after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the French were thrown out, and the French established one country, Vietnam. Not two countries, just one country. All right. Same thing happened in Vietnam that happened in Korea. The communists supported the people close to their border, which was the north, and so they divided the country. They only took half, but they always wanted the other half, which eventually they got. And so the United Nations divided the two countries up, made a demilitarized zone, and the idea was that the South would be capitalist and the North would be communist, and everybody would be happy. And if you wanted to be communist, you just move north, and if you wanted to be capitalist, you just move south. Well, of course, the communists never want people to vote that way with their feet, so they prevented them from doing that, of course. But so did the South, for that, all that matter. But then America got all involved, and I don't want to get into a long story, but it got all involved because it didn't like the people who were elected as president of South Vietnam. And there was a coup, and the CIA basically murdered the president of South Vietnam, and it was a mess, all right? So even though we had that goal of two separate countries with two separate political systems, that was achieved. But it really wasn't the goal that either side really wanted. Both sides really wanted unification and to win. And so the thing dragged on for years and years and years and years. But the idea, so it became an unjust war, basically. It became an unjust war with no definable goals and no definable winner. And so when we pulled out in 1975 and took all the American troops out, took all the American advisors out, and everything else, and the South Vietnamese government completely collapsed under the pressure because the Russians and the Chinese did not pull out of North Vietnam, all right? And so they kept supporting them, and so you can't win something like that. But again, like Afghanistan, it's like, hey, we're not going to win this, so let's just go home. So that's what they did. So that was unjust. It was a just war, it became an unjust war. Okay? Afghanistan, just war became an unjust war. Iraq, just war became an unjust war. That can happen in history and has many times. But you got to have goals, and you got to make them declared. You got to say, this is what we're going to do. Okay? It's like in World War II, it was declared many times, we're not going to stop until we've taken over Japan and Germany, and we have eliminated the Nazi government and the imperial Japanese government. That's the goal. The goal is, and that's where my father was told, I don't care how many points you got, Sergeant, all right, you're in for the duration. I don't know if you've ever heard of anybody being sent home without being wounded or whatever. Nobody that I know of, nobody my father knew, nobody that any of my veterans that I knew, World War II veterans, none of them I ever knew, full and healthy, not a scratch on them, got sent home before VJ Day or VE Day. You were in for the duration. And the way they did that is every time you got close to the number of points you needed to go home, to rotate home, they raised the number of points. Tricky how the government does that. But at least there was a definable goal. Get rid of Hitler, get rid of Tojo, that's the goal. Okay. And finally, it is conducted with moral means, let's say, in moral way. This one, again, very controversial. The problem becomes what's moral, what's not. It's been decided, was decided in World War I, or actually after World War I, it was decided gas is immoral. Everybody decided that. The losers, the winners, everybody. They all decided we're not going to do that ever again. So gas warfare was decided to be immoral. We don't do that. Since then, biological warfare has been, by the United Nations, by the Geneva Convention, to be declared immoral. You're not supposed to use biological weapons against your enemy. That's immoral. Okay? There is some controversy about nuclear war. Some would say that's obviously immoral because it's indiscriminate. Well, come on. Firebombing is indiscriminate too. Landmines are indiscriminate. There's a lot of things that are indiscriminate. Even you could say economic warfare, putting a boycott or putting a blockade around a country, like the U-boats were supposed to keep all supplies from getting into England. So basically Hitler originally intended to starve Britain into submission. That was the original intent. That was the purpose of the U-boats. And same thing with the Kaiser in World War I. That was the other. The people would say that's indiscriminate because you're not just starving the soldiers, you're starving the civilians. And since the soldiers usually get the rations and usually get food before the civilians, you're starving the civilians first. All right. So immoral means and immoral way. If you're going to apply that using biblical terms against non-combatants, against innocent, of course nobody's innocent, but innocent civilians, then that would probably make every war ever fought by anybody an unjust war. So that one's a little dicey. It's a little hard to apply. I don't know that you can apply it across the board. It's a little hard. But those are the 5 rules of a just war, a war in which we could say the Bible would support, or we could say God would be pleased as he ever is with human sin. We could say we're doing this within the bounds of God's guidance, direction, okay, something like that, all right? So these are the 5 things that you would apply to any kind of military action in any case, and in other words, to come up with a answer: is this a just action? If you don't want to call it a war, is this a just war? Now, it's a little too early, perhaps, in this particular situation. Current situation happened yesterday. It's pretty early to try to apply all of these. Yeah.
Because what happened is he was indicted, and
Yeah.
he is known as a criminal.
Well, again, the difference is between him and Noriega, between him and Grenada, and him and numerous other ones, is that this is a legitimate leader of another country. Well, yeah. Putin has been indicted by the criminal court. Mao Zedong was found culpable by the United Nations. I mean, if we're going to go into any old country we want to, kidnap the leader and transport that leader and take over the country. This morning I just heard, was it Rubio or the other guy? I can't remember which one. I think it was Rubio. Say, we are basically going to run Venezuela. Huh? He said, somebody else said it though, but besides him. But somebody said, we're gonna run the country. So we have, quote unquote, conquered another nation. That we say, well, we're relieving suffering. Well, I don't know if anybody's suffering any more than the Muslims in China, being rounded up, put in prisons for no particular reason except they're Muslim. Christians in China, of course, even before that were done. I mean, the numbers of people suffering in China, if you want to include all of Tibet, which was conquered by China illegally, all right? If you want to, or in Nigeria, for example, okay, the government continually resists any help that we want to give them to keep the Christians from being slaughtered. Russia, another good example. Russia, people suffering in Russia tremendously, especially certain groups that Putin and his government do not believe are real Christians. Lutherans among them. Okay? Lutheran churches being raided, Lutheran churches being, pastors being imprisoned, okay? So there are a lot of countries around the world that you could make the argument, I could make the argument, okay, that the people are actually a lot worse off than they are in Venezuela. A lot worse off. They're a lot worse off in Saudi Arabia, where women are not allowed to drive. Okay? And where people are beheaded on a regular basis because they're not a good enough Muslim. Right? So if we're going to go around and we're going to depose leaders, we're going to actually kidnap elected leaders, legitimate leaders, we're going to kidnap them, bring them back to the United States, and take over the running of the country. If we're going to do that with Venezuela, why don't we do that with any of the countries I named? Why don't we do that with China? Why don't we do that with Russia? Why don't we do that with Myanmar, Burma, which terrible human rights abuses going on there, absolutely horrible. Okay, why don't we do that with Ceylon, Sri Lanka? We got such problems with South Africa. Trump has real problems with South Africa. Let's just take it over. Let's take over Nigeria too while we're at it, and Uganda too while we're at it, and Zambia too while we're at it.
But none of those leaders
Doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with anything. We're not talking about a judicial system here. We're not talking about judicial system. Judicial system has nothing to do with it. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Zero. Nada. No. You cannot go to another country and say somebody, okay, you've broken our laws in this country, and so we're going to take you to this country. You can't do that. If that was possible, think about it. Think about it. If that was possible, you could go to any place on the planet and kidnap anybody you want to. What happens to sovereignty? What happens to sovereignty? Would we like that? I don't think we would like that. I don't think we would like if the president of Mexico all of a sudden decided, look, I don't like razor wire put on my border, and so Trump, we're going to arrest you and bring you to this country. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, folks. Okay, let's understand that. All right. Would we want a special forces group from Russia flying to D.C., breaking into the White House, kidnapping our president and his wife, putting them on their plane and flying them back to Moscow?
Yeah.
Well,
Europe was sending drugs and killing our people here.
again, so are China. So is China. So is Argentina. So is Chile. So is Brazil. So is Colombia. We're going to take over the whole world? All right. Anyway, that's the 5 rules of just war. Yeah.
So, Ukraine and Russia,
Yeah.
I guess that is not a just war, because none of those 5 things apply.
I would agree with that. I would say that's not a just war on the part, certainly on the part of Russia, who invaded. When you invade somebody, now, biblically speaking, you're in the situation where, biblically speaking, Ukraine has every right to do everything they want to do. Russia has no right to do anything, biblically speaking. Okay, well, and they both believe that they're Christian countries. As a matter of fact, they brag about it, both of them. I don't think Putin's got a leg to stand on, frankly. Now, if you want to go all the way back to when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, all right, I suppose you can do that. You can make an argument that Putin is just taking over territory that was originally his. Yeah, but then if you go back another 1,000 years, Ukraine was a sovereign country before Russia was. So, I mean, these are arguments best left to diplomats and negotiators.
I'd rather keep them out.
Well, would it be a just war for us? Unless we can make some kind of argument both as to just cause and prudent measurable goals, I don't know. I don't know if you can make that argument. Again, a lot of these things are nebulous, and again, it's like possession, the law of possession, right? Right, law of possession. The one who has it is the one in possession has it. Rules, or the golden rule, the one with the gold rules, right? So a lot of cases, these. It's like trying to, like the British colonel trying to impose the Geneva Convention on his Japanese commandant when he has no leverage. Now, eventually, the true story, of course, of the Burma Railroad, the commandants of some of those Japanese prisons were hung as war criminals, just like some of the Nazis were hung as war criminals. Okay? Goering, if you watch the movie, makes an interesting point. He says, if the shoe were on the other foot, we'd be hanging you. Right, but Goering is exactly right. For the firebombing of Dresden and Lolland, which was totally unnecessary, and Eisenhower's policy of specifically targeting the rail lines to the work camps. A lot of the reasons that the people in the camps, not just Jews, but others, were as emaciated as they were, is because all of the supply routes, both rail and road supply routes to the camps, were specifically targeted by Eisenhower in his plans to defeat Germany. Because he felt that using these as work camps helped continue the German government, which was true. And when he found that out through intelligence, that's why the bombing raids changed in 1944, or early 44 to late 44 and into 45, of specifically targeting those areas around those camps, so that no food, no medicine, no anything could get into the camps, even though he knew that the prisoners in the camps, Jews and others, far outnumbered the guards and whatever. In other words, he knew he was starving prisoners. He knew that, and his records show that. This was discussed. They told him, you do this, and this is going to cause the thousands and thousands and thousands of prisoners to starve to death. And he said, I don't have any choice. At least that's what he thought. Now, looking back at it today, we would say that was immoral means and immoral methods. But at the time, again, if we had lost, Eisenhower would have been hung. Patton would have been hung, right? MacArthur would have been hung. Well, probably not MacArthur. But yeah. When the shoe's on the other foot, it's hard. And again, we have the 2020 hindsight of looking back into history and knowing more than, let's say, the voters in 1940 or the voters in 1944 had any way of knowing. Exactly.
To me, I mean, even though I understand why we did it,
Right.
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 But still, those people have
Yeah, no clue. And a lot of people make that argument today, and they would say, really, if you're figuring in a balance between, what do they say, 5 million casualties of American forces invading the islands of Japan, and that's not all death, that's both killed and wounded, 5 million casualties as opposed to, what, 3-4 million deaths from those two cities, they would say that's not fair. That's not a fair way to, because these are combatants. These 5 million, they know, hey, they go in eyes wide open, okay? Hey, we were volunteered or we drafted and, whatever. Whereas the other people were out doing their shopping that day and, got wiped out. So, all right, it's not cut and dried, ever. It's not cut and dried, unless you're looking back again to the 100 Years' War. Or you're looking back to Rome and Sparta, or something, then you can say, okay, that's pretty cut and dried. But it usually takes 1,000 years before you can decide on a historical event, especially on its ethics and morals. Okay, all right. Well, we need to wrap up a couple of things here. We need to wrap up the horses. Let's wrap up the horses. All right, and so we are talking about the pair of the scales and all that stuff in the third horse. All right, pair of scales in his hand, a quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. That's verse 5. So let's look at notes number 19. The pair of scales represents first the rampant cheating that invariably comes from famine, as scales are often fixed to benefit the seller, and also the general economic imbalance that will always exist in the world. In other words, there will always be haves and have-nots, those who have plenty and those who have little or none. In this case, it is specifically referring to food. Some people will have food in abundance, while others will have little or none. Some will be filled, some will starve, such is the way of this sinful world. Now, as this plays into the last days, this is becoming a reality, though in a very slow way. You hear people talk about the gap between the rich and poor in Western society, not just the United States, but Western society in general. And that gap is growing, middle class is shrinking. Okay? In other words, people in the middle class are finding it harder and harder and harder to afford regular things. Okay? I saw a statistic the other day that kind of shocked me. When I was in high school, you could work at a part-time job. You could work at McDonald's, you could work at, a drive-in, wherever, you could work someplace, and you could make enough money in that year to pay for a semester of college, you yourself. You wouldn't have to get money from your parents, you wouldn't have to get loans from anybody. You could make enough money in a year in high school, you were 16, able to get to a job, you would have make enough money for a semester of college. Average. Now, we're not talking Harvard, okay, or Stanford, right? But average, okay? Today, you can't do that. I don't care if you string together 2 or 3 part-time jobs when you're in high school. You're not going to be able to afford a semester of college, unless it's maybe a community college or 2-year college. But in most cases, you're not going to be able to afford going to a 4-year university, state university. Right? Not going to be able to do that. Okay? It's going to be impossible. Right? So in that itself kind of shows you what was, you can look at other statistics. When I was growing up, my mother did not work outside the home. She worked at home. She stayed at home. She took care of things at home. She was always home when I got there, always. Okay? That was true until my sister, who was 7 years younger than me, got her own car and got to working herself when she was 16. Then my mother started working at the church part-time. But you could support a family of 4 on one income. And that means pay the mortgage, pay for a car, maybe even a used car on top of that, okay? Clothes, food, whatever. You could support 4 people in a normal run-of-the-mill life. That means taking summer vacation to Disneyland or going to the Grand Canyon or whatever. You could support those 4 people and do those things, go to the beach, whatever, on one income. Can't do that anymore. You can't do that anymore unless your one income is CEO of Chrysler or whatever. So what God is telling us here is that as we get closer and closer and closer to the last day, this idea of this gap between the rich and poor will continue to widen and continue to be more and more of an issue. Okay? Number 20, the description: a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius do not harm the oil and wine, simply adds detail to the fact that what is being depicted is the reality of famine in the world. So what happens with famine? Food prices skyrocket. A denarius, a quart of wheat, you grind that down to flour, you're going to be able to make 1, maybe 2 small loaves. A denarius was, in many cases, the payment, a salary for an entire day. In some cases, was payment for the salary for an entire week. Many of what we would call day laborers or hand laborers, field laborers, that would be for a whole week. So imagine you get your check for the whole week and you're able to buy 2 loaves of bread with it. That's it. Nothing else. No meat, no cheese, no vegetables, no nothing. 2 loaves of bread. That's it. Now that's famine. Okay. A denarius was the average wage for a day's work, and a quart of wheat would make about 1 loaf of bread in those days. So it's depicted here as a great cost of a worker would have to pay to feed his family, something he would be unable to do on any regular basis during a lifetime. Again, this is the average guy. This isn't the really poor guy who's chopping cotton or whatever. The oil and the wine are not to be harmed, that is, they're not allowed to spoil. The poor will not be able to afford such luxuries, so they are sold for great profit to the rich to be consumed. Thus the rich will have plenty, the poor will have little or none. The tyranny of the rich and those in power over the poor and oppressed is not only seen by their violent acts of bloodshed, but also by their denial to share their plenty with them. Again, this will be the general rule throughout human history. The wealthy sharing with the poor will be the exception. You may know that in the United States of America, still, even though it's less, but still more charity money is given than any other country in the world, and it's not even close. I mean, if you listed them all, the top 10, the United States would be number one. Number two, if you put them on a bar, you know, the bar would be this big for the United States and it would be this big for the next country. I mean, it's not even in the same ballpark. It's not even the same galaxy. Okay? The money given in the United States for the poor, for charity, for food, or, you know, food banks, Salvation Army, you know, you name it, all of them is exponentially great compared to other countries. Now, I will say that part of the reason of that is because the other countries are taxed up the wazoo, and the government takes care of the poor for the most part. So it's not left to individuals to do it, but the individuals pay humongous taxes. Okay? So probably if you threw the taxes in, then the bar would probably be a lot closer. Note, this exception is to be the rule for believers, and especially for brothers and sisters in Christ who are to share all things with each other. Okay. Yes, it does. And the Christians were some of the first to practice what I would call practical socialism. There's a difference between ideological socialism or theoretical socialism and practical socialism. You can apply practical socialism to a small group, usually, and it can be probably very effective. The kibbutzes in Israel, especially in the early days, in the 1950s, were socialistic. All of the material was put in a common pot. Now, they all lived within the whatever fence or compound. They all lived within the compound. You know, people were designated. You're the sewer. You know, you're the seamstress. You're the plumber guy. You're the electrician guy. You're this. You know, everybody. Okay, you know, I'll do that. I'll do this. You know, it was very volunteers. Okay, but it worked. And some of them, there's not many anymore that were like that, but there are a few that are like that. Communes out there in the West. There were some in New Mexico and a couple in Arizona and California that actually worked. They actually functioned very efficiently and effectively. And you can do that with 30, 40, maybe 50 people. You get a little bit more than that, it becomes unwieldy, it becomes difficult to work. Try to apply it to a whole city, try to apply it to a whole state, a whole country, never works. Never works, ever. Never works. There's too many moving parts, there's too many... sin, basically, we would say, Christians would say, sin enters in too much.
The key is the word that just you used, and that is work.
Yeah, work.
That is assuming that 40 or 50 people, all 40 or 50
Exactly.
And if you got a whole bunch of people doing nothing.
Exactly. Well, the best example of this is Plymouth Colony. I don't know if you know this, but Plymouth Colony was a socialist state, if you will, for a while. Almost everybody died. All right, they had 100 some odd people, 120, I forget exactly how many, 150 maybe. Most of the people just quit working entirely because they said, what's the point? I will never get ahead. If I work extra hard, I don't get to keep an extra head of cabbage. I have to give that cabbage up to somebody else who's not working. And that kind of ticks me off. And so, you know what? That ain't gonna work. All right? So, yeah, you get to a point where it just doesn't work. Plymouth Colony got to a point where the governor said, okay, enough of this, we're not going to do this anymore. You keep whatever you grow and sell whatever you want. And all of a sudden, people started to get healthy again, and the colony survived. Capitalism worked where socialism failed. And that's been the case. Again, any scale above 50, 60 people, that's usually what happens, 9 times out of 10. As any capitalist will tell you, socialism has been tried thousands of times in the history of mankind and never worked, except on a very, very small scale. Very small. But in the church in Jerusalem, yes, in the church in Jerusalem, I don't know how many people were there, but in the church of Jerusalem, everybody put everything in a common pot, and the deacons, distributed, and it really was, as Marx himself said, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That it actually worked in the church in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, persecution came in, and that was the end of that, and has never been tried since. Except,
Very interesting to see what happens in New York.
yeah, it will be. It will be. I would hate to be part of an experiment.
Well, we're going to pick it up.
Well, Trump says he's not going to do that. He said, "Sorry, you guys got to. If you guys starve, it's on you." I guess Boston and Philadelphia will have to chip in, maybe. I don't know. Okay. Okay. One more horse. Yeah, we got enough time for the last horse. Lamb broke the seal. The ashen horse. Some translations have green. Some have pale. The rider on the pale or sickly green horse is named Death, and Hades follows with him. This rider symbolically demonstrates that death is a result of the first three. So when you have tyranny, bloodshed, war, and famine, guess what happens? You get a lot of people dead. Okay? Now, some people have said the green horse is plague, and that the grave or Hades follows. Okay, that's not much of a different interpretation. In other words, it still fits. This is what always happens. War, famine usually follows war, and plague usually follows famine. And tyranny usually causes war. So you got tyranny, war, famine, plague.
And third,
Yeah.
doesn't number 4 denote the whole world?
Yeah, it does. Yes, yes. This is the routine that's going to be everywhere in one way or another. Hades here has a broad meaning of grave, not hell, for even believers in Christ will be victims of the horrors inflicted by horsemen. So you in the New Testament especially, and even in the Old Testament too, when you see Gehenna or you see Sheol, you can't always interpret that as hell, because the word has two meanings, both Old and New Testament. It means hell in some cases, other cases it just means the grave, the place of repose for the body, without the soul. Nowhere in the Bible are believers promised that these calamities will not affect them. Some churches teach that these things will not happen to believers. And they teach that because they believe in what's called the rapture, and that the believers will be raptured out of this world, and then all these 4 horses and everything will happen to the people left behind. That is not what the Bible teaches anywhere. 21. The writer of 22, sorry. Death follows the first 3 horsemen to collect their victims and commits them to Hades. Hades, okay, I already said that. 23. Let us also understand that it is not death and Hades that are given authority over a fourth of the earth. Some interpret this to mean that only a fourth of all people will end up in hell. This does not match what the rest of Scripture declares. The rest of Scripture says many are called, few are chosen. Wide is the way to hell, and many are on it. Narrow is the way to heaven, and few are on it. That's the rest of the Bible. It's very clear about that. They, in verse 8, refers to the 4 horsemen. John sees each horseman individually at first, but then he sees all 4 right off together to inflict judgment upon the earth. The fact that a fourth of the earth is inflicted shows that God's mercy and grace, for while tyranny, bloodshed, war, famine, and death will be the general rule on earth throughout human history, Christ as King will permit only a certain portion at a time to experience suffering of death at their hands. He is always in control and very often limits the damage that could be done by if tyrants were allowed to totally have their way. We can see this in history numerous times. Numerous times, let's just focus on the Cold War, for example. I personally know, through my reading of history, there were at least 3 times where nuclear war and total annihilation should have happened. That the people on one side or the other were prepared, ready, and able to push the big red button, and had announced their intention to their allies and to their command structure that such was going to happen. One time happened in the early days during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev was intent on not being bullied, and if it hadn't been for Malenkov and a couple of his advisors to talk him down, probably we would have all been incinerated. There is Jesus inserting himself into history and solving the situation. Another time that I know of, I know there are more than this, okay, and more than 3. I've been told there are as many, by certain people in the military, I've been told there are as many as 8 that have actually happened over the years. One not too long ago, a couple of years ago, I was told. Anyway, one happened during the last days of the Nixon administration. Nixon was disheveled. He was a mess. He hadn't slept in a long, long time. He felt there was a threat of Russia's launching nuclear missiles, and he put the nuclear forces in the United States on like a 30-minute alert, something like that. Basically saying, DEFCON 4, basically saying that, in a few minutes you are going to get the launch code authorization. That is going to happen. That went out. Now again, cooler heads prevailed on him not to do that, but we came that close to total devastation. I forget what the third time was. The third time was towards the end of the Soviet Union, sometime in the late 80s, but I can't recall that. It had to do with ships at sea and submarine. There was, I think, a submarine, a United States submarine ran into a British ship. No, a Soviet submarine ran into an American naval ship, and the Soviet submarine's missiles were compromised, something along those lines. That's all I can remember of it right off the top of my head. So again, Jesus steps in and sees to it that even though the devastation is great, like what did we have, 100,000, 200,000 people die in that tsunami back 20 years ago, whatever it was. So death can be very widespread, very, very large, but not, total. That's the idea. Number 25, pestilence, deadly disease, wild beasts are added here to show that death and the grave will not only come by human hands, but also by viruses and animals. Again and again, human history shows the horrors depicted by these 4 horsemen. Uncounted millions have perished at the hands of tyrants and through wars, famines, disease, and attacks from animals. These things are very evident in our own day and age. If anything, tyranny, war, bloodshed, disease, and death are more pronounced today than even centuries ago. How long will these things take place? How long will these 4 horsemen be permitted to inflict their horror upon the earth? Until the last day when Christ returns. This is why the return of Christ is the blessed hope of all believers, for they long for the day when the horror of living in this sinful world will finally be removed. And we'll stop there. We'll pick it up then at verse 9, read the last parts of the chapter, and start the 5th seal. Questions? Let's close. May the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be and abide with us all. Amen. Okay. They've been having a hard time hearing again. She. Uh-huh. Oh. Oh, I see.
So now I have 4 check